Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, hello, Regis Kilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and these are the 10 worst designed RNG cards in the game. In other words, these are the most destructive, unpopular, and frustrating cards with random elements to play against. So let's go ahead and jump into the list. Starting off with number 10, this might surprise some people. You don't see the word random on this card anywhere, and you probably haven't even seen this card in a while. But the problem with Dr. Boom, of course, is his Boom bots that he summoned, which have a death rattle that says deal 1 to 4 damage to a random enemy. So the problem with boombots, of course, is just how much variance and value they pack in to that tiny little body. In other words, not only is it random which target is hit, but there's also the random element of how much damage they do. So sometimes you can hit a 4 health target for 1 damage, which sucks. Sometimes you can hit a 1 health target for 4 damage, which feels a little wasteful. And sometimes you can hit that super high value face target that only has 8 health remaining, despite 7 enemy minions being on the board for 4 damage twice, killing your opponent against insane odds. So there's really awful 2 damage outcomes, really amazing 8 damage outcomes, and the full range in between into a card that's already really good. That's what made Dr. Boom so darn playable, but equally so darn frustrating. Moving on to number 9, it's another popular legend. Moving on to number 9, it's another popular legendary this time around. It's Ragnaroks the Firelord. This is another card that can just make or break a game depending upon how its random outcome goes out. So 8 damage to a random enemy. Sometimes that, again, will be a 1 health minion killing that useless Silverhand recruit, and other times it'll snipe the enemy's face for lethal. And that range of outcomes and the raw power of this effect make Ragnaroks the Firelord, despite being very good, rather destructive sometimes when it comes to RNG. Now for my number 8 card, it is the little guy Knife Juggler. Even though this card was nerfed, it's still a pretty powerful and negative influence on the game thanks to how strong it is in the early game with these random elements. Basically, it's an annoying little tiny ping that if you only get 1 or 2 doesn't feel so bad, but the potential for this card to snowball out of control and have a very profound impact in the early game makes it really problematic in certain kinds of decks, and historically a card that has frustrated a lot of Hearthstone players more than maybe anything else. For my number 7 spot, it is the card Murloc Knight. Now this one may not really see all that much play in the constructed format, but in Arena, this is the kind of card that can be absolutely devastating in its randomness. The problem, of course, is that there are so many different Murlocs to choose from, giving you an insane amount of variance. Plus, it's really not hard to trigger this effect at least once, and sometimes more than once, so that randomness really starts to pile up. You'll get sometimes the terrible 1/1 Murloc that's useless. Other times you might get another Murloc Knight and just spiral out of control even further. So a card like this, which is just good in terms of value, plus has so much variance built into its randomness, is not good for the game. And if you thought Murloc Knight was bad, take a look at my number 6 card, Wrangler. It takes the amount of variance for summon minions through the roof. There are so many different beasts in the game, and those beasts are always changing, which is problematic too because it limits card space design for Blizzard. But you can get really awful beasts, and sometimes you can get the Gazrilla or the King Crush or the crazy stuff that is an absolute instant game winner for only 5 mana. If this card was 10 mana with better stats, the randomness wouldn't be quite so bad because it wouldn't influence the game at a point where it's just totally game-breaking. A 10 mana, say 6/6 plus a King Crush might be something an opponent could deal with, but a 5 mana 3/3 plus a King Crush is much more problematic. So the mid-game influence of this card is just too strong, and the variance is so high, and the effect is instant, all of which make Wrangler really bad for the game. Moving on to number 5, it is the Mage spell Unstable Portal. Now, even though you maybe haven't seen this one in a while, the problem with this card is that sometimes it's just an instant win button. Occasionally it will get you that 5 mana Tyrian Forge Ring that just dominates the game and is unbeatable as far as your opponent is concerned. And really, the problem with this card is that there's not that much downside to it, so there's really big swings as far as good potential is concerned. But even if you get a Wisp out of this card, basically that's saying spend 2 mana and get a Paladin hero power, which really isn't that bad in the scheme of things. So the downsides, I mean, that would be a pretty poor result, but it's not an instant lose button, despite the fact that this sometimes does give you an instant win button, and that's a very unhealthy balance, and it makes this card really playable, introducing some ridiculous, unpredictable randomness into the game when it was still in standard format. For my number 4 spot, it is a 4 mana card that is all about swing potential. It is the Warlock spell Implosion. The problem with this one is that even though there are only 3 total outcomes in this card, you either hit for 2, you hit for 3, or you hit for 4, it doesn't seem that random. The difference between that 2 damage hit and that 4 damage hit could sometimes absolutely change the course of a game. If you target this on a 4 health minion, you only hit for 2, your opponent's minion lives, and you only get 2 1/1s back. But if you somehow hit that 4 health damage hit, that's so significant because you could kill a minion and you'd get 4/4 in stats back, making this just the most ridiculously overpowered card anytime it hits for 4. Even when it hits for 3, it's really good. So it just feels like a card that punishes your opponent no matter what. It has an instant effect, and the randomness can absolutely decide games at this point in the mana curve. So a card that is very frustrating to see as an opponent, and sometimes a card that's a little bit frustrating as a player as well, because you know the potential it has, and it doesn't always live up to that potential. And now it's time for the top 3, starting off with a card that won't surprise too many people. This is Tuskar Totem, widely considered one of the most destructive forces on the Hearthstone ladder these days. The problem, of course, with Tuskar Totem is that there's a big range of results. Sometimes you can get the awful 0/2 healing totem. Sometimes, of course, you can get the totem golem that is a 3/4, which would in and of itself cost about 3 mana on average. So there's a ton of upside to this card with things like Mana Tide Totem, sometimes Flame Tongue Totems. And even the downsides, it's still a pretty high value card. You're going to get roughly 3/4 or 4/4 in stats no matter what, even on the worst outcomes. So there's no downside or risk to playing the Tuskar Totem, and occasionally it just gives you those game-winning totem golems as well. Another problem with this card is that it does limit the design space of the game. For the entire time this card is in standard format, basically Blizzard can't make really cool, ridiculous totems that do cool things or have instant effects. So it's both bad in the actual game state itself, but also bad as a design limitation. So Tuskar Totem, it's a strong card, undeniably, but a bad card for the game. Moving on to my number 2 card, you may be detecting a theme by now, and that any minion which summons a random minion can be very problematic, and Barnes is really the ultimate example of that. This 4 mana card from One Night in Karazhan summons a 1/1 copy of a random minion from your deck, and you might say, well, that's a pretty nice limitation on a random effect in that it's a 1/1 copy, so the total potential swing isn't that high. But of course the problem is that some minions, even as a 1/1, are still too darn good and have effects which are worth so much mana. For instance, of course, the ultimate example might be a card like YoggSaron, which even as a 1/1 still summons a minion at the end of your turn, allowing you to do some crazy stuff like summon a second YoggSaron that, of course, has a giant body attached. But there's other examples like Ragnaroks or Sylvanas, cards which don't have much value as far as a body is concerned, but have a ton of value as far as an effect is concerned, giving Barnes really the kind of thing that can summon a 10 mana value turn, or even more, since he also has some body value attached as well. So the swing potential here is ridiculous. It's frustrating to play against because it's an instant effect that you can't predict or play around, so there's no counterplay to Barnes, making him an incredibly destructive force in Hearthstone that also, again, cripples design space because you can't make cards that play well with Barnes, or you could just totally ruin the game. So a frustrating card in the field, a destructive card behind the scenes as far as design limitations are concerned. And even though he's awfully good in certain decks and with certain cards, he's really not good for the game as a whole. This should come as no surprise. YoggSaron is number 1, the worst designed RNG card in Hearthstone. If you don't know why, just start playing. You'll figure it out. And that's going to wrap it up for my list. Those are the worst RNG cards in Hearthstone as far as design is concerned. I'm sure you think I'm crazy, or I missed some cards, or I got the order all wrong. If so, let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear them. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, game on.